So scannable visuals are easy to understand at a glance. And here's an example of what we mean. On the left, you can see the original before slide that starts to visualize some generational data. It's flat, it's hard to read, it doesn't clearly communicate a story without digging into the content. On the right-hand side, you can see a simple redesign that makes the actual data story much clearer. Now you can clearly see the relationship between items without having to hunt through the slide piece by piece. Scannable visuals and slides can be easily understood by the audience. They have a clear visual hierarchy, a strong main idea, and a simple layout. So when you're updating a design, how do you keep your slides clear and focused when you're trying to visualize complex data? By following three elements of scannability. Whether you are refining designs or building from scratch, each visual should track to these three principles. The first one, focus content with a key takeaway and no unnecessary words. The second, purposeful visuals that support the content and add to the story. And finally, the third, a clear layout that highlights your takeaway and spotlights data. If you apply all these ideas to your data viz, you're going to have stronger designs that are easier for your audience to understand. Let's take a look at some ways that you can get to a scannable data visualization. If you were wondering why we started with so much background information about the audience and story, this is the reason. Scannable content is tight and clearly communicated. When you're dealing with large amounts of complex data, it's very easy for visuals to get overloaded with extra information. That's why getting your content down to its essence is necessary for keeping your visual focused and clear. So the first and maybe most important tip we have is to simplify your content. On the left-hand side, the before example, you can see that there are essentially two different infographics around American labor regulations on the same slide. Already, the viewer has to struggle to know where to focus or figure out what the main message is. On the right-hand side, the after example, you can see that we've combined the two main visuals into a single infographic. Now the main takeaway is much easier to find, and the visuals aren't competing with each other for attention. In general, you want to limit your data visualization to one infographic per slide. It can be tempting to stack multiple charts together if they feature overlapping content or supporting proof points, but adding more information at the same time doesn't strengthen the point, it dilutes it. If you want your story to come through clearly, you need to make sure it's foremost in your audience's mind. On the left, the original has a handful of supporting data points that aren't necessary for the main takeaway of the slide. Instead, they slow the viewer down as they're trying to parse through the slide. On the right, we again are removing any unnecessary data for a cleaner, more streamlined visual. So to help keep your audience focused, remove any redundant or unnecessary data from your visuals. So we've made already a few points about removing unnecessary elements of your slide. And the next step on the list to be removed is a key or a legend. The slide on the left uses a not insignificant amount of space on a legend that really doesn't add much for the viewer. And worse, the viewer has to do more work to understand how the key relates to the chart. In the after version, we built the color coding right into the visual, meaning we removed the extra element and made the remaining content work harder. In general, we try whenever possible to remove or streamline these explanatory elements because a properly designed visual simply shouldn't require them. Even if you don't do it this way, you can still ask yourself whether a key or a legend is really necessary, or if it's just there because that's what Excel creates by default. We just went through a few tips on what you should remove from your slides, but what should you be adding? And how do you know how many or what visuals to include? In general, every visual you include on a slide should be purposeful and add something of value to the story you're trying to tell. Let's look at a few examples of how it works. One of the simplest and most effective strategies is to make your key takeaway pop. On the left-hand before slide, you can see that the main takeaway essentially just looks like the other data on the slide. There's no hierarchy indicating that it's important. So on the right, the after version, we made a point that that it's the biggest thing on the slide, and we moved it to a place of visual prominence on the green background. If there's a big number you want to wow your audience with, make it big, make it bold, or make it stand out in some other way. This idea works the other direction as well. If you have something that needs to be on the slide but isn't a high priority, make it small and less prominent. Sometimes highlighting important things is as much about minimizing the noise as it is about pumping up the key figure. Data visualization excels at reinforcing relationships and proportion. The left slide simply lists out numbers, but the way it's presented doesn't add to the information. The refined version on the right uses a chart that helps show the relationship between the numbers in the chart and the key takeaway on the right. When you're starting to translate your data from basic content to visuals, the types of visuals you should use should suit the content and the story. So really, the idea isn't that you should always think about proportions or donut charts, but instead think about how the visual you choose will reinforce or add to what's being shown in the data. And sometimes you even need to go beyond what the data on the slide says. On the left, you can see that the before version only lists out the components of the chart. To make the story stronger and more complete on the right-hand side, we added up the individual lines to show the total. The point isn't just that we move the data into a chart, it's about pausing to assess the data. If you're just directly designing what's in your doc your team hands over, you might not add this extra idea. This example of why some of the more process-driven steps we started out with are so important. Thinking above and beyond the specifics on the page is what separates a bad idea from a good one. All right. So you focused your content on the essential information. Your visuals are purposeful and supporting your data story. Now, how do you bring it all together? With a clear, clean layout that puts your data story front and center. Don't get lost in the appeal of creating a beautiful visual if the pieces don't serve the story and help communicate the data. Here, you can see on the original before slide on the left, it's packed with arrows, dots, connecting lines. You can tell that they were intended to add additional information and context to the data, but the reality is they simply confuse the viewer. Instead of focusing on the content, first the audience needs to decipher through the visuals and figure out the key message on their own. So on the right-hand side, we removed all the decorative elements to really focus on the core data story. Any visual element from the chart itself to the shapes and rules that support it should work in harmony with the story, not draw individual attention. Our next tip is about aligning your text to improve scannability. On the before slide, the text is all over the place. In the redesign, we aligned everything to one slide. It's a simple solution that makes the slide much easier to scan and read. This might seem like a pretty specific point to make, but what this demonstrates more than anything is taking an audience-focused view of your content. When you're dealing with a lot of data or complex visualization, always keep in mind that the easier it is for your audience to scan, the more successful the slide will be. So look for ways to reduce the amount of mental work the viewer has to do just to grasp the basic content of your slide, even if that means simplifying some unique visuals. And finally, our last design tip goes back to the very first idea we shared in this section: reduce the amount of text in your visual. The copy on the left is a textbook example of a bad slide title. It's too long alongside the dense and complex content of the original design. On the right-hand side, all we did was trim it back to about half its length. You could go further and write a title that adds to the story more, but for simplicity's sake, sometimes just editing it down is enough to make a difference. The last thing your audience should be doing during a presentation is reading detailed copy on your slides. So whenever possible, and as much as possible, reduce the amount of copy in your data visualizations. To recap, making your visuals more scannable is a simple approach to consistently creating engaging, high-quality slides. Scannable slides are based on 3 elements: focused content, purposeful visuals, and a clear layout. And while we have 3 distinct ideas and several concepts underneath each, all of this is just about making one thing. It's making your content clearer for your audience. When used properly, these techniques put your message at the center of the visual and make it easier for the viewer to grasp. Do that, and you'll see the quality of your data storytelling go through the roof.